On a foggy October morning in 1985, the Newport fishing docks fell silent after the most audacious waterfront heist in Rhode Island history. 23 commercial fishing boats were stripped of their seasonal earnings in under 40 minutes. No witnesses, no arrests, no second chances. The thieves vanished with $2.6 million in cash, leaving behind only questions and empty safes. For 30 years, the case collected dust in federal archives, forgotten by everyone except the families who lost everything that day. But in 2015, during the demolition of an abandoned bait house on the edge of Newport Harbor, construction workers discovered something that would crack open the coldest case the FBI had ever shelved. What they found wasn't money, but it was enough to unravel a conspiracy that had stayed buried for 3 decades. The morning of October 14, 1985, began like any other along Newport's commercial fishing district. The harbor buzzed with the familiar rhythm of diesel engines warming up, gulls circling overhead, and crews preparing for what many hoped would be their final profitable run before winter set in. The season had been exceptional. Record catches of striped bass, bluefish, and flounder had filled boat holds and bank accounts alike. By mid-October, most captains were sitting on their largest cash reserves of the year, money they'd used to maintain their vessels through the harsh New England winter months. The docks stretched along a quarter-mile of waterfront, lined with working boats ranging from modest day trawlers to 60-foot commercial rigs. Each vessel represented years of investment, generational knowledge, and the economic lifeline for dozens of families. The community was tight-knit, built on trust and mutual dependence. Captains knew each other's routines, crews shared equipment when needed, and everyone understood the unspoken rules that kept the industry functioning. At the center of this world stood Zion Anthony, a respected boat captain who had worked these waters for over 15 years. His vessel, the Maria Elena, was a 42-foot trawler that he'd purchased in 1978, with money saved from working double shifts at the Narragansett shipyard. Zion had built a reputation for fair dealing, steady catches, and quiet leadership. Other captains sought his advice on weather patterns, fishing grounds, and equipment purchases. His crew was loyal, his boat was well maintained, and his business was thriving. Before we continue deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What made October 14th different wasn't immediately apparent. The morning started with the usual pre-dawn preparations. Crews arrived early to load gear, check engines, and review weather reports. The forecast called for light winds and calm seas, perfect conditions for what many planned as their last major fishing trip of the season. By 5:30 a.m., over 20 boats had cleared the harbor entrance, heading toward established fishing grounds 15 miles offshore. The timing of their departure would later prove crucial. The thieves had clearly studied the harbor's rhythm, understanding that early morning departures meant empty boats and skeleton crews left behind. What remained on the docks were the night watchmen, a few maintenance workers, and the secure storage areas where captains kept their seasonal earnings. Most fishing operations in Newport followed similar financial patterns. Captains preferred cash transactions, paying their crews in bills and keeping their earnings in heavy-duty safes bolted to their vessels. This wasn't unusual in the industry. Cash meant immediate payment for crews, no bank delays, and the flexibility to make quick equipment purchases or fuel arrangements. It also meant that on any given day during peak season, the docks held hundreds of thousands of dollars in readily accessible currency. The harbor's security was minimal by today's standards. A chain-link fence surrounded the main dock area, but access points were numerous and poorly monitored. A single guard station sat near the main entrance, staffed by rotating personnel from a local security company. Most boat owners relied on the community's reputation for self-policing, and the assumption that outsiders wouldn't know which vessels carried significant cash reserves. At approximately 6:15 a.m., while the fishing fleet worked waters miles from shore, a white panel van entered the dock area through a service gate that had been left unlocked. The van bore the markings of a local marine supply company, complete with faded lettering and rust stains that suggested years of legitimate use. 3 men emerged from the vehicle, dressed in standard dock worker clothing, hard hats, work boots, and reflective vests. They carried toolboxes and moved with the purposeful stride of maintenance crews arriving for scheduled work. What distinguished this crew from legitimate workers wasn't visible to the few people present that morning. They knew exactly which boats to target, where the safes were located, and how to access them without triggering alarms or attracting attention. They moved systematically from vessel to vessel, spending no more than 8 minutes on each boat before moving to the next. Their first target was the Cassandra May, a 50-foot dragger owned by Captain Marcus Williams. Williams had enjoyed an exceptional season, and his boat's safe contained nearly $180,000 in cash, payment for 3 weeks of prime catches sold directly to Boston restaurants. The thieves used professional-grade cutting tools to open the safe, working with practiced efficiency, while one man maintained watch from the dock. The pattern continued across 23 vessels. The crew knew which boats held significant cash reserves and which could be bypassed. They avoided boats with crew members sleeping aboard and targeted only vessels where the safes could be accessed quickly. No alarms were triggered, no guards were alerted, and no witnesses observed anything suspicious. The operation's precision suggested extensive advance planning. Someone had studied the harbor layout, identified the most profitable boats, and mapped out the most efficient route between targets. The thieves knew which captains kept cash on board, where the safes were positioned, and how to open them without leaving obvious signs of forced entry. This level of inside knowledge pointed to someone with deep connections to the Newport fishing community. By 7:45 a.m., the white van departed through the same service gate it had entered. Behind them lay 23 opened safes and a devastating financial blow to the tight-knit fishing community. The thieves had worked for exactly 90 minutes, moving through the harbor with methodical precision and disappearing before anyone realized what had occurred. The first sign of trouble came when Captain Jerome Washington returned early from his fishing trip due to engine problems. His boat, the Sweet Caroline, had suffered a hydraulic failure that forced him back to port before 9 a.m. As he secured his vessel, Washington noticed that his cabin door was slightly ajar, something he distinctly remembered locking before departure. Inside, he found his safe standing open, its contents completely removed. Washington had stored $95,000 in cash from recent sales, money he'd planned to use for winter boat maintenance and crew bonuses. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He immediately checked neighboring vessels and discovered the same scene repeated across the marina. The Newport Police Department received Washington's call at 9:23 a.m. Within minutes, patrol units arrived at the docks to find a scene of systematic theft unlike anything in the department's history. 23 boats had been burglarized with surgical precision. Safes had been opened cleanly, with minimal damage to surrounding areas. Personal items, electronics, and fishing equipment remained untouched. Only cash had been taken. The scale of the theft became clear as investigators interviewed returning captains throughout the day. Initial estimates placed the total loss at over $2.6 million, making it one of the largest cash thefts in Rhode Island history. The FBI was called in by evening, and the case was immediately classified as a federal crime due to the amount stolen and the organized nature of the operation. But as investigators would soon discover, this wasn't just a simple theft. It was the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the Newport fishing community for 30 years, until an abandoned building and a forgotten drum finally revealed the truth. Detective Ray Coleman had seen plenty of theft cases in his 15 years with the Newport police, but nothing like the systematic precision of the harbor heist. The FBI agents who arrived that evening brought resources and expertise, but they also brought questions that cut to the heart of the close-knit fishing community. How had the thieves known which boats to target? Who had provided the detailed intelligence about safe locations and cash reserves? The investigation would test loyalties that had been built over generations. The federal team, led by Special Agent Patricia Hendricks, established their command center in the harbor master's office. Hendricks was a veteran of organized crime investigations, and she immediately recognized the hallmarks of an inside job. The thieves hadn't wasted time searching or exploring. They'd moved directly to their targets with the confidence of men following a predetermined plan. The interviews began immediately. Every boat owner, crew member, and dock worker was questioned about their whereabouts that morning, and their knowledge of who might have access to sensitive information about the fleet's finances. The fishing community, normally open and cooperative, began to close ranks as suspicion fell on their own neighbors and friends. Captain Williams of the Cassandra May provided the most detailed account of his losses. Beyond the $180,000 in cash, he described the methodical way his safe had been opened. No damage to the locking mechanism, no scratches around the dial, no signs of forced entry. Someone had either known the combination or possessed professional safe-cracking skills. The same pattern held true across all 23 vessels. As the investigation deepened, attention inevitably turned to those with the most comprehensive knowledge of the harbor's operations. Dock supervisors, fuel suppliers, equipment vendors, and longtime residents all came under scrutiny. But it was Zion Anthony who found himself facing the most persistent questions. Anthony's reputation in the community was sterling, but investigators noted several factors that made him a person of interest. His boat, the Maria Elena, had been one of the few vessels left untouched during the heist. His 15 years of experience gave him intimate knowledge of every captain's routines and business practices. And his quiet leadership role meant that other fishermen often confided in him about their financial situations and concerns. During his initial interview, Anthony maintained his composure despite the obvious implication of the questions. He'd been at sea during the theft, his crew could verify his whereabouts, and his own boat contained nearly $140,000 in cash that remained untouched. Why would he orchestrate a theft that bypassed his own vessel while targeting his friends and neighbors? Agent Hendricks pressed harder during a second interview 2 days later. She'd discovered that Anthony had briefly worked at a Boston security company in 1979, installing and maintaining commercial safes. The job had lasted only 8 months, but it provided him with technical knowledge that few others in the fishing community possessed. When confronted with this information, Anthony acknowledged the work history but insisted it was irrelevant to the current investigation. The pressure on Anthony intensified when investigators learned about his financial difficulties from earlier that year. The Maria Elena had required major engine repairs in spring of 1985, work that had cost him over $35,000 and forced him to take out a loan against his boat. Several fishermen confirmed that Anthony had been stressed about the debt and had mentioned needing an exceptional season to get back on solid financial ground. But the case against Anthony remained circumstantial. His alibi was solid, verified by multiple crew members who'd been with him 15 miles offshore during the theft. His boat's untouched safe actually worked against the theory that he'd orchestrated the heist to benefit himself, and his reputation in the community remained largely intact, with most fishermen refusing to believe that Zion Anthony could betray the trust they'd placed in him. The investigation stalled after 6 weeks of intensive work. Despite interviewing over 200 people and following dozens of leads, federal agents had identified no concrete suspects and recovered none of the stolen money. The thieves had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed, leaving behind only the methodical precision of their work and the devastating impact on the Newport fishing community. The financial consequences rippled through the harbor for months. Several smaller operations were forced to sell their boats when they couldn't afford winter maintenance without their seasonal cash reserves. 3 family businesses that had operated for generations closed permanently. The tight-knit community that had thrived on mutual trust began to fracture as suspicions lingered and relationships soured. Insurance claims provided partial relief for some victims, but many fishermen had relied on cash transactions that were difficult to document for insurance purposes. Captain Williams eventually recovered about 60% of his losses. Others weren't as fortunate. The Sweet Caroline was sold at auction when Captain Washington couldn't meet his loan payments without the stolen funds. Zion Anthony weathered the investigation but found that the suspicions had damaged his standing in the community. Some fishermen continued to trust him completely, but others maintained their distance. Crew members became harder to find, equipment suppliers demanded cash up front, and the easy camaraderie that had defined his relationships with other captains was replaced by careful politeness and unspoken tension. By spring of 1986, the FBI had officially suspended active investigation of the case. The file remained open, but no new leads were being pursued, and no agents were assigned full-time to the matter. The Newport fishing community gradually rebuilt itself around the void left by the theft, but the questions never fully disappeared. Who had possessed the inside knowledge necessary to plan such a precise operation? Where had $2.6 million in cash disappeared to? And why had the thieves never been caught despite the intensive federal investigation? For Zion Anthony, these questions would follow him through the next 3 decades of his life. He continued fishing from Newport Harbor, eventually paying off his boat loan and rebuilding his reputation through consistent hard work and fair dealing. But he never forgot the weight of suspicion he'd carried during those dark months of 1985 and 1986. The theft had changed him, made him more guarded and less trusting of the community bonds he'd once taken for granted. The case file gathered dust in federal archives, occasionally reviewed when similar thefts occurred elsewhere, but never generating new leads or suspects. The Newport fishing community moved forward. New families joined the industry, and younger fishermen learned the trade without knowing the full history of that devastating October morning. But the older generation remembered, and they passed down stories of the day when trust was shattered and $2.6 million vanished into thin air. What none of them knew was that 30 years later, the demolition of an abandoned building would finally provide the answers they'd been seeking since 1985. In 2015, the old Martinelli Bait House sat like a forgotten monument to Newport's maritime past. The weathered building had served the fishing community for over 40 years, providing everything from live bait to ice to emergency equipment repairs. But by the turn of the millennium, changes in the industry and the harbor's gradual gentrification had left the structure abandoned and slowly deteriorating under the relentless assault of salt air and neglect. The building's demolition was part of a larger waterfront redevelopment project, designed to transform the industrial section of Newport Harbor into mixed-use commercial and residential space. For weeks, construction crews had been systematically dismantling structures that had defined the working waterfront for generations. The Bait House was scheduled to be the final building removed before ground preparation began for a new luxury marina complex. Marcus Williams, now in his 60s and no longer actively fishing, had been hired as a site supervisor for the demolition project. His knowledge of the harbor's layout and the building's histories made him invaluable to the construction company, tasked with the careful removal of structures that might contain hazardous materials or historical artifacts. Williams had never fully recovered from the 1985 theft, but he'd found steady work in construction and marine services over the intervening years. On a cold Tuesday morning in March, Williams watched as the excavator operator began tearing into the bait house's concrete foundation. The building had been constructed in the 1960s with a deep basement that had served as cold storage for bait and ice. As the machine's hydraulic claw bit into the foundation walls, Williams noticed something unusual in the debris pattern. Most of the basement had contained the expected remnants of a commercial operation: rusted equipment, old refrigeration units, and decades of accumulated fishing gear. But in the far corner, wedged between two foundation supports and partially concealed by a collapsed section of flooring, sat a large metal drum that didn't belong with the rest of the building's contents. The drum was industrial grade, designed for long-term storage of liquids or chemicals, but its placement was wrong. It sat in a space that would have been inaccessible during the building's normal operations, tucked behind structural elements in a way that suggested deliberate concealment rather than routine storage. Williams called for the excavator to stop and climb down into the partially demolished basement to examine the drum more closely. The metal container showed significant corrosion from 30 years of moisture exposure, but it remained structurally intact. More importantly, it was sealed with a heavy-duty lid that had been secured with multiple layers of industrial tape and plastic wrap. Someone had gone to considerable effort to protect whatever was inside from water damage and discovery. Williams felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the implications. This wasn't random debris from the baithouse's operations. Someone had deliberately hidden this drum in a location where it might never be found, behind foundation walls in a basement that had been sealed and abandoned for years. The question was what lay inside and who had placed it there. The construction crew gathered around as Williams used a crowbar to pry open the corroded lid. The seal broke with a sharp hiss, releasing air that had been trapped inside for decades. What they found wasn't money, but it was something that would prove far more valuable to investigators seeking answers about the 1985 harbor heist. The drum contained carefully wrapped documents, photographs, and personal items that had been preserved in waterproof containers. At the top of the collection was a handwritten letter dated October 20th, 1985, just 6 days after the theft. The letter was addressed to whoever finds this and signed by someone identifying himself as Devin Mitchell. Mitchell's letter contained a detailed confession to planning and executing the Newport harbor heist. But more than just an admission of guilt, it provided a complete account of how the theft had been organized, who had participated, and what had happened to the stolen money. The confession painted a picture of betrayal, violence, and desperation that would finally explain why the case had remained unsolved for 3 decades. According to Mitchell's account, the heist had been the product of months of careful planning by a crew of 4 men, all with connections to the Newport area, but none actively involved in the fishing industry. Mitchell himself was a former merchant marine who had worked briefly on fishing vessels in the early 1980s before moving into more lucrative but illegal activities. His knowledge of harbor operations and boat configurations had made him the natural leader of the group. The inside information that had enabled the thieves to target specific vessels with precision hadn't come from within the fishing community itself, but from someone with access to financial records and insurance documents. Mitchell's letter identified this source as Carmen Rodriguez, a clerk at the Marine Insurance Agency that provided coverage for most of the harbor's commercial fleet. Rodriguez had been recruited by Mitchell through a combination of financial pressure and romantic manipulation. She was struggling with debt from her mother's medical bills and had become vulnerable to Mitchell's promises of easy money and a better life. Over several months, she'd provided detailed information about which boat owners carried significant cash reserves, where safes were typically located, and when vessels would be away from the harbor. The confession revealed that the theft itself had unfolded exactly as investigators had suspected. Mitchell's crew had used Rodriguez's intelligence to map out their targets and plan their route through the harbor. They'd worked with professional efficiency, opening safes with tools and techniques that Mitchell had learned during a brief stint working for a Boston security company in the early 1980s. But what the FBI had never discovered was what happened immediately after the theft. According to Mitchell's account, the crew had planned to divide the money and scatter to different parts of the country, never to contact each other again. The initial split had taken place in an abandoned warehouse in Fall River, where the $2.6 million was divided into 4 equal shares of approximately $650,000 each. The plan began to unravel within hours of the division. One of the crew members, identified in the letter as Jamal Washington, had become paranoid about being caught and had threatened to turn himself in to police in exchange for leniency. Mitchell and the other 2 crew members, brothers named Kevin and Andre Patterson, had decided that Washington posed too great a risk to their freedom. What followed was a confrontation that turned violent. Washington was killed during a struggle in the warehouse, shot by Kevin Patterson when he tried to flee with his share of the money. The surviving 3 men now faced not just federal theft charges, but a murder charge that could result in life sentences or execution. Mitchell's letter described the panic that followed Washington's death. The original plan of splitting up and disappearing individually was no longer viable. They needed to dispose of the body, clean the crime scene, and find a way to launder the money without attracting the attention that Washington's disappearance would inevitably bring. The solution they adopted was both practical and cruel. Washington's body was weighted down and dumped in deep water off the Massachusetts coast. His share of the money was divided among the surviving 3 men, giving each of them approximately $867,000. But the increased amount made the money harder to spend without attracting notice. Mitchell's confession detailed how the crew had struggled to convert their cash into usable assets. Banks required documentation for large deposits, and the serial numbers on some of the bills could potentially be traced back to the fishing boats. They needed time to develop strategies for gradually introducing the money into the legitimate economy. The Patterson brothers had decided to flee to Florida, where they had distant relatives and believed they could start new lives with clean identities. But Mitchell had chosen to remain in the Newport area, believing that running would only attract more suspicion. His plan was to hide his share of the money and gradually access it over many years, creating the appearance of legitimate income through various cash-based businesses. The drum in the bait house basement had been Mitchell's insurance policy. If something happened to him before he could fully launder his share of the money, the confession would serve as his final testimony. He'd included detailed information about the location of his hidden cash reserves, believing that eventual discovery of his story would provide some measure of justice for the victims of the theft. But Mitchell's careful plans had been disrupted by events he couldn't have anticipated. According to his letter, Carmen Rodriguez had become increasingly unstable in the weeks following the theft. The guilt over her role in the crime, combined with the trauma of learning about Washington's murder, had pushed her toward a psychological breakdown. Rodriguez had begun drinking heavily and making cryptic references to terrible secrets she was carrying. Mitchell feared that she would eventually confess to police, implicating all of them in both the theft and the murder. His letter described several tense confrontations where he'd tried to convince Rodriguez to maintain her silence, but her mental state continued to deteriorate. The confession ended abruptly with Mitchell's statement that Rodriguez had become too dangerous to trust, and that he was taking care of the problem permanently. The letter was dated October 20th, 1985, and contained instructions for accessing Mitchell's hidden money, but it provided no information about what had happened to Rodriguez, or whether Mitchell had carried out his implied threat against her. Williams stared at the confession in his hands, understanding immediately that he was holding the key to the case that had haunted the Newport fishing community for 3 decades. But the letter raised as many questions as it answered. What had happened to Devin Mitchell? Had he killed Carmen Rodriguez as his confession suggested? Where were the Patterson brothers now? And most importantly, was any of the stolen money still hidden somewhere, waiting to be recovered? The construction site fell silent as Williams called the Newport Police Department. Within an hour, detectives and federal agents were examining the drum and its contents, photographing every document, and carefully cataloging the evidence that had been preserved in the basement of the abandoned bait house. The discovery would reopen not just the investigation into the 1985 theft, but potentially multiple homicide cases that had never been connected to the harbor heist. Carmen Rodriguez had been reported missing in November 1985, just 3 weeks after Mitchell's confession was written. Her disappearance had been investigated as a possible suicide or accidental drowning, but her body had never been found. Jamal Washington's absence from the community had been noted, but never officially reported. He'd been known as a drifter who moved frequently between cities, and his family had assumed he'd simply relocated without maintaining contact. The revelation that he'd been murdered during the aftermath of the theft would require investigators to re-examine missing person reports and unsolved homicide cases from the fall of 1985. For Zion Anthony, now 68 years old and long retired from fishing, the discovery brought a mixture of vindication and renewed pain. The confession proved that the suspicions directed toward him during the original investigation had been completely unfounded. But it also confirmed that the tight-knit community he'd cherished had been infiltrated and betrayed by people who'd exploited the trust and openness that defined the Newport fishing culture. The drum in the bait house basement had preserved more than just a confession. It had captured a moment in time when greed and desperation had shattered the bonds that held a community together, leaving scars that had never fully healed. Now, 30 years later, those wounds were about to be reopened as investigators began the process of following Mitchell's trail and searching for answers that had been buried as deeply as the drum itself. The investigation into Mitchell's confession moved swiftly once federal authorities confirmed its authenticity. Handwriting analysis matched samples from Mitchell's employment records at the Boston Security Company, and details in the letter aligned perfectly with evidence that had never been made public during the original investigation. Agent Patricia Hendricks, now nearing retirement, was brought back to lead the reopened case alongside a team of cold case specialists. The first breakthrough came within days of the drum's discovery. Records from the Fall River Police Department revealed that an abandoned warehouse matching Mitchell's description had been the site of a suspicious fire in late October 1985. The building had burned completely, destroying any physical evidence of the money split or Washington's murder. But fire department reports noted that accelerant had been used, suggesting deliberate arson rather than accidental ignition. More significantly, investigators discovered that the warehouse had been leased under a false name just 2 weeks before the harbor theft. The rental agreement bore Mitchell's fingerprints, providing the first concrete link between the confession and verifiable criminal activity. The timing suggested that Mitchell had always planned to destroy the evidence, viewing the warehouse as a temporary staging area rather than a permanent base of operations. The hidden drum had finally delivered what 30 years of federal investigation could not. Devin Mitchell's confession unraveled the mystery that had torn through Newport's fishing community, clearing Zion Anthony's name and revealing the true scope of betrayal that had devastated so many lives. While the stolen money was never recovered and justice remained incomplete, the truth had emerged from the shadows of an abandoned basement. Sometimes the answers we seek aren't buried in the places we expect to find them.